This is another episode of Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. And now the architects, Doug Patt and Stephen Chung.
You are watching or listening to the Design Your Dream Home podcast with Doug and Steve. I'm Steve, that's Doug. Good morning, Doug.
Good morning, Stephen. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you. And Doug, you know I'm so excited today because we have our first guest.
Yes.
Eric Reinholdt from 30 by 40 Studio. Eric's going to join us. And so I'm excited because I know Eric pretty well. I know his work. I know he does a lot of things that intersects with things that we do, YouTube. He's an architect. He has a drone, all these kind of fun things that we sort of share. So we're excited to have Eric. Hey, Eric, welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks. Great being here.
Great to see you, Eric. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, a little quick bio for those of you who don't know Eric. Eric Reinholdt is an award-winning architect, father, mountain climber, guitar player, blogger, and author.
What are you talking about?
He is the founder of 30 by 40 Design Workshop, a residential design studio bordering Acadia National Park on the Mount Desert Island on the coast of Maine. So it's sort of near Bar Harbor, I guess. That's a really nice, beautiful place in Maine. This is where he lives and practices in a modern longhouse designed by himself with his wife, 2 boys, and 1 cat. His architecture is simple, modern, site-specific, and craft-driven. It features local materials and familiar forms juxtaposed against modern, open floor plans with minimalist detailing. The work celebrates humble materials, subtle contrasts, and finely crafted details. Okay, Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Sounds like you take it after my website, huh?
I did. I read all about you, Eric. I read your website. Eric, tell us about yourself. You practice a little differently than some architects, and I think people might be interested to know how you work.
Yeah. So, moving up to here, up to Maine. Maine's a pretty rural place, obviously. And so, there's a great population around here, a vacationing public around here. So lots of vacation homes, second and third homes. So great work. But it's also not work that comes around all the time. And so I've had to kind of structure my practice in a way that, I can do lots of different things and support the business in a way, that someone who's maybe larger or in a more urban area where projects, the churn of projects is a little bit faster. Up here, the projects come, there's more time between when projects sort of arrive on my desk. And so I've structured the practice in a way where I can do a whole variety of things. And it's actually not unlike what you do, Doug, I think, in that, I have lots of personal interests. I love photography. I love making films. I love making videos. And I love writing. And so all of these things sort of support my creative life. And I've kind of used that to feed and build a practice that capitalizes on all those aspects. And so I've used each one of those sort of arms of my practice to support the business, in various ways.
Yep.
that generate income for those times that are a little bit leaner, in the winter time or a time when there's not a lot of people buying, new property up here. And that has allowed me to have the practice, also have a greater reach. So, for example, on my YouTube channel, I end up using that as a kind of educational outreach, a vehicle for teaching other people about the value of architecture, not unlike what you guys are doing with this podcast, sort of sharing my knowledge. And then I'm using that as a lead generation. So I'm using that to get new clients. I'm also using that to reach students. And so that helps feed the practice, in many different ways. And so it is a little bit non-traditional, but I love it because it's kind of like Charles and Ray Ames, right? Everything is a design challenge. And I really have treated all of these different aspects of my business as a design challenge. And for me, that's really a fulfilling way to practice.
Okay, so you are practicing in a way, in a traditional sense, in the sense that someone will come to you and want you to design a home. So that's, I guess, more conventional in a way. And then the other things you're talking about are you have a YouTube channel and go on and on. Because more specific, because I mean I know all about it, but for those who are listening, maybe explain a couple of the other activities that you're involved in.
Sure. So with the YouTube channel, it's a new video every week. So it allows me to practice sort of making videos and making films and storytell, educate people about architecture and residential architecture in particular. And so I'll make videos on the kinds of topics that my potential clients would be interested in. So as the video goes out there and people are searching online, they find, let's say, a topic on long kitchen islands, and it comes to a video where I'm teaching about that. And so immediately I've kind of become the expert on that, and they're able to find me through those videos. So that's a way for me to get sort of client, that's sort of marketing for me. But it's also a way for me to generate some ad revenue. So, YouTube runs some ads on the videos that I'm making. So that gives me a little bit of ad revenue. And then what I also do on top of the YouTube videos is I have a set of pre-designed plan sets. And so if I'm making a video about, let's say, a dog trot, the building typology of a dog trot, which is kind of a unique building type that I'm really interested in. Well, I have a whole bunch of dog trot plan sets on my website. So on the video where I'm educating someone about what a dog trot is and the value of it is, how it came to be, people can then see a link to my website, which has a place where they can purchase the plan sets for a dog trot. So it's just thinking about practice in maybe a more entrepreneurial way. I have books that I've written, and so I'm able to use the YouTube channel to get that message out there, and that's really focused more towards, say, architecture students or people who are younger in practice and they're looking for a new way to practice. And so I've shared sort of all the lessons I've learned by doing this in those books. And like I said, I had the plan sets and other sort of digital products that just help people with residential design or help people get into, the kind of practice model that I'm doing, which is, a little more liberating than the sort of traditional office model where you pop into an office and you're working there for 8, 10, 12 hours, whatever it is, and then heading home. It's more like I was saying, the life of Charles and Ray Ames. It's like your whole life is this practice, and it becomes sort of, engrossing, all-encompassing like that. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And what about this film? I think both of you guys are unique, and you're both filmmakers. I mean, I know Doug just released a film, and you also, I saw a really nice film about your life. What was about that? What was that about? Why do that?
Well, that was really an exercise in. So I had the YouTube channel since 2013, and it was kind of slowly growing. But really this year I set as some goals for the firm personally, for me personally, that I want to become a better filmmaker. I want to learn more about it. And so the best way that I knew to do that was to hire somebody who had been making, short videos and really collaborate with them and see what I could learn through that process. And, it was a great learning experience. Not only did I geek out on all the equipment, like, I know you guys are, equipment nerds and that kind of thing. So that was great to see all that. But also it was a lesson in how to be a better storyteller. And, really this, the sort of 3-act narrative, the 3-act structure where you're setting up, the conflict and then the resolution of the conflict. How to weave a story together is really, a great lesson, I think, for all of us. And having the YouTube channel in general teaches me to become a better storyteller, because pretty quickly that, after 3 minutes, people are just wandering off. And if you're not telling a good story, they're not going to be watching. And so doing this short film really taught me, how to become a better storyteller, how to show somebody rather than just tell them, because I think on my YouTube channel I was doing a lot of telling rather than showing. And so that short film was a chance to really step up my video making capabilities and the quality of my work. And it really it's made such a big difference in the channel. So the channel's really just exploded over the past couple of months now. And I feel like it's a result of investing in that sort of short film. And it was just screened at the Architecture and Design Film Festival. So, it's a great way to kind of, rub elbows with people who I wouldn't normally be rubbing elbows with. It's kind of stretch your legs a little bit.
Fantastic. Hey, Doug, any follow-up questions before we begin with the 3 tips from Eric Reinholdt, our guest?
No, other than to say I think his approach is really wonderful because it's so comprehensive. And, thinking about work and your business as part of this whole multimedia proposition is really valuable for guys like me. So I love listening to you talk, and this is going to be great.
I appreciate that.
Congratulations. Some great work.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, Eric. So we know you are a multimedia superstar. I think our audience is interested in maybe some of your work as an architect. We are wondering if you could give us three things you're thinking about in residential design, things that maybe a homeowner might find interesting. Do you have 3 pieces of advice for them?
Yeah. I might have more than, but I'll stick to 3.
Okay, number 1.
Yeah. So all of my thing comes back to sort of fundamentals. So, I think there's a few basic things that if you consider them from the outset of a project, I think the design is always going to land in a good place. And so I think the sort of first thing is to always be thinking about how you can make spaces smaller. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Dieter Rams, the industrial designer. He worked for Braun. I've sort of adopted his 10 principles for good design as kind of the guiding principles of my practice. And it's like the only thing that's on my walls in my studio are his 10 principles. But he has this book that's titled Less But Better. And that kind of sums up my approach to thinking about space. I've been really interested in this challenge of, how I can make smaller, more impactful architecture. And I'm not talking about, I know there's this trend toward like these micro houses, and I'm not talking about that because I feel like those make so many compromises in terms of living space. But in the sense of designing spaces that can do more than one thing. And I think, Japanese architecture does this really well. Their space constraints require them to fit a lot of things into a small amount of space. And, I'm seeing this real trend with clients just, it used to be bigger houses, now it's smaller. And I think the cool thing is there's all kinds of side benefits to that choice too. So not only does it cost less to build smaller, it's less expensive to heat, expensive to maintain, less expensive to build. They consume fewer resources. And so there's all of these kind of, side benefits of doing that. So, things like doubling up on offices and bedrooms. So I'm seeing a lot of that now where it's like used to be a dedicated guest bedroom. Now we're doing office bedroom, like it can be a multifunctional space. So it has more than one function programmed into it. Or, I know people are talking a lot about like this open living concept going away and people are going back to more sort of compartmentalized design. And I'm not seeing that at all here. It's still open space living. But what I am seeing is that, we're doing more built-ins, which can accommodate like all this different function. So you have kitchen, dining, living room, there's all this cabinet designing now that hold an office area, a work area, a place for the kids to do their homework, adult space, books, but also pantries and appliances. So all this stuff can live in this like one big room, and you can put it away when you don't want the clutter and you're having people over. But it's also really functional. You can open up and use it as you intend to use it during sort of regular everyday life.
I just want to ask you a question about that. So we actually had a topic, an episode where we talked about size. Does size matter? And it sounds like you're talking about that. And we also talked about how Zillow and things like this actually become almost difficult to get around because a homeowner will come to you and say, I want 5 bedrooms, the master bedroom should be 20 by 19. And it's like, why do you want that? Or where do you need that from? And then apparently they're looking at real estate sites and what everyone else has. And it's sort of, how do you break out of that? How do you say, listen, how big a house do you really need? Do you really need a 4,000 square foot house? So how do you get to that point where you say, why don't we build what you really need or what you really want as opposed to what you think you need or something like that? How do you have that conversation?
So, the way I do it is I always accept kind of what they bring to me as a given. And then I always try and have this dialogue where, the value of working with an architect is that they bring a different perspective to the table. But, I find that if I just immediately reject that notion that they have of wanting to do a 4,000 square foot house when they don't actually need one, if I immediately reject that, there's this sort of level of trust that just goes away right away. So what I do is I sort of take that as a given, and then I take the opposite approach, the approach that I think is maybe more sensible. And I put that on the table, and then I put one that's sort of in between the two. So I generally go with kind of 3 concepts. So here's what you asked for. Here's what I think you should do. And then here's something that's kind of in between. And we'll usually end up somewhere in between rather than one extreme or the other. But it opens up this broader conversation, this dialogue. Like, okay, well, what do you need? Like, so I'm working with some clients right now who came to me wanting pretty big house. I mean, they basically wanted to build out to the lot lines of this lot, right? It's not, I'm sure you guys are used to this, right? And it doesn't make sense for so many, reasons. Like, there's all this natural light. If we step back from the property line, we could do this and this. And so it's great because you can put their scheme on the table and say, here's why this doesn't work. And you can put yours on the table and say, check this out. Like this is a better way of doing it. And it's actually smaller and it costs less to build. And over time, it's all these benefits that come in. And usually that conversation lands where I think it should land as an architect. Like, we're going to build something that's smaller. But the other way that you could start having it is, like what you're saying, do you actually need this amount of space? This couple that I'm working with, like, they have a grand piano and they have a harpsichord. And like, those are big instruments. I mean,
they need space
right up front. And so, that means that we're probably going to have more open living space, and that living space is going to be larger than I would normally make it. But that's the other way to have it. It's like, what do you have? And like, let's look at that on, a plan and see how it actually works for you. What kind of furniture you have. Like, if they have a 12-foot long dining table, that's a different dining room than, maybe a standard dining room. So I think that's one way that I have that dialogue.
Awesome. Doug, any questions on does size matter, I guess, for Eric?
No, want to hear more.
Okay. All right. Subject or topic number 2, Eric.
Okay. So you kind of alluded to this in my bio, but, I'm kind of obsessed with materials, and particularly humble materials, low maintenance materials, and kind of an honest use of materials. And, I have a really hard time with these materials that like this porcelain tiles that are trying to look like wood planks. Like, I don't know how you guys feel about this. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but I have a hard time with those kind of things that are trying to be something that they're not. So I love using materials like plywood. I mean, you can see behind me, my studio is like covered in plywood, basically. There's like humble materials, concrete, natural woods, things that are going to wear in rather than wear out. And I always, I say this to my clients when we're talking about materials. I have this leather chair in my living room, and I think I bought it with the first bonus check that I ever got as a real architect, Christmas bonus check, right? Buy this leather chair. And that chair it keeps getting better with age. And that's kind of my, mantra when it comes to choosing materials. Like, with age, they should always get better. So, I feel like concrete does that really well. I feel like Galvalume does that really well, natural cedar shingles. And these are, local, humble building materials. And they're not always the cheapest materials, but in a lot of cases, they are pretty economical, actually. If you look at a sheet of plywood, a 4x8 sheet of plywood, you're getting this look of this warmth of wood, but it's really, labor efficient to install a 4x8 sheet of plywood. Like, it's super easy to do. It doesn't cost that much. So yes, there might be a, upcharge for the material cost because the veneer on the plywood is a little more expensive, but you save on the labor, and it ends up being these really beautiful sort of, natural wainscoting, I guess, if you will. And so, I've been experimenting a lot with concrete, and, when you talk about sort of humble, basic materials, you can make them interesting by simply changing their texture. So with concrete, like, you can polish concrete, you can hone concrete, so I'm doing a lot of board forming now. So you get all these textures, these wonderful textures out of like a really simple, basic material. And they're super durable. I think they're beautiful, especially like concrete paired with wood, that contrast. I just love. I can't get enough of that. But there are these ways to take these humble materials. If you take a wood, you can sort of hit it with a wire brush and change the texture of it. You can use it in a plain sawn fashion and get that texture out of it. You can oil it. You can sand it. All these like wonderful things that you can do just by subtly changing the material in place. Rather than using all these fancy moldings and trims and these appliques, I much prefer to go to just a honest expression of what the material is, how it's fastened together. The plywood here is it's screwed to the wall. So I expose the fasteners, and like that becomes a pattern in the wall. That becomes sort of beauty in itself. And it doesn't like cost any more to do it. It's actually cost less to do it that way than it is to conceal everything. So
you have the right attitude about materials to me, which for me, of course, and Doug knows, I've been an advocate of porcelain and all these other materials. It's so bad. I feel bad about it, but I just kind of accepted it because of the kind of clients I work with, developers, and some of these, and I felt bad about it initially, and now I've sort of accepted it, and now I've embraced it, and I really convinced myself that perception is more important than reality. What thinks, what looks like will be enough. But I believe in the things you're talking about. I just have found it difficult to to do that all the time.
Yeah, and that's not to say, I've used some of that stuff too, and it's an interesting question. I think in an ideal world, we would all be purists, and we'd all have, the granite or flamed slate or something like that in lieu of a porcelain tile that looks like it. And I've done both. Which do I prefer? The natural thing, the real thing, but it doesn't always work out that way. And so I think this, practicing architecture is all about compromise, right? And so you have to figure out where that plane of compromise ends up being.
Well, Doug, you've had a lot of high-end clients like Eric has had. So when you've had a choice, you've always been more for the natural material, right?
Yeah, I mean, typically our clients have the money to do anything they want, which is anything we want. So that's the direction we're headed. What we don't always see is contractors able to do the things that we really want. So a question for you, maybe you can address this at the end. Board formed concrete, for example, and they have to kind of know what they're doing. And there are lots of different things that you can do with concrete. So do you have a tough time finding contractors that can actually do that work in the area?
Yes. Okay. I mean, it's really interesting because there's all these things. Clients bring objects and images to you all the time. Like, I want to do this. And then that's the rub with the architect. It's like, oh, okay, how are we going to make this happen? And so, just doing that here was a huge education piece. And it was not only like educating myself and what the right thing to do is, but also finding the contractor. And then also, once you get into this, you realize there's all these things in place in the concrete industry. And I'm sure it's like this in any industry. But what we found was, there's no incentive to stock wall ties, which hold the forms together at any different length than what they're at now, which is, increments of, say, 2 inches. Let's just say, for example, when you add boards on the inside of your forms and you have a different setup, then all of a sudden, all the guys who are supplying concrete ties to all the concrete contractors, they don't want to play in that game. And so, because I was looking at getting, say, fiberglass ties, so you can just cut the fiberglass ties off at the wall and they're not rusting out on the face of it. Nobody will install fiberglass ties in the state of Maine. They won't do it because there's one guy who supplies all their materials and they won't go elsewhere. It's a very funny situation. So it ends up being an educational component. And I actually really enjoy this about practicing architecture and building things is like those points where I don't know and they don't know, and we get to meet in the middle and go, okay, well, let's figure it out together. So we end up using a plasticizer, and we end up, figuring out how to attach the boards on the forms so that they're, not wrecking the forms, but they're also not having exposed fasteners everywhere. And then you just end up learning all of these things about the contractors that you're working with and yourself. And so, I love that about architecture. Is it for everybody's budget? No, but what we've done with this one project where we started this was now we've educated that local contractor, and now all the other people that are asking him for it, he's becoming the expert in the area. And so it starts to kind of spread, this knowledge base begins to spread. And so I'm sharing it on the YouTube channel, and I have other people asking me questions. And so like, that's what I love about conversations like this too. It's like you put it out there and then you never know kind of how it can take off and the people that it's empowering to do better things in the world. So I love that about it.
Let me ask you a question about this, because you are, like me, practicing mostly alone. You are in kind of it's not that remote, but you're in Maine and there's not a lot of architects around. I'm in Boston where there's lots of architects, but because I'm antisocial, I don't reach out to them. How do you, you run into this kind of issue here? You don't know, you don't have the knowledge, and if you're working in an office, you'd say, "Hey, Doug, you ever encounter this, or does anyone know how to do this?" Like, how do you, sort of work like that? How do you, when you're in isolation in a way, how do you, look to others, and how do you do that? I mean, I'm sort of wonder about that.
Yeah, well, so there's a couple of things. I mean, this is kind of a remote place, but there's about 25 architects within 25 miles of me. So there's a lot of people coming after the same client. So there is some of, I do have some contact with other architects. So if I get in a real jam, there's a lot of phone calls I can make. But, what I've been doing more and more now is kind of going out online and reaching out to other people who have, there's this guy in Austin, Texas, for example, who I reached out to for the board form concrete, Matt Reisinger. He has this great YouTube channel. He's a builder. He works a lot with architects. And so, he was working with this one architect on this project on board form concrete. So I called him up. I was like, how did you do this? This looks great. And, so I was able to do some research online, but then also make contact. So reach out on LinkedIn, reach out to people who are writing blog posts about it. So, for me, that is easier to do those kinds of things than it is to maybe walk down the street to somebody else's office and say, "Hey, let's have a cup of coffee and talk about this." Right. It's also more immediate. But I do feel the pangs of isolation like that. That's hard. That's a real issue. I think for a lot of solo practitioners, even when you do practice in an urban area. So
I have a friend, an architect in Indiana. He has a thing of coffee a day. And Jeff has made it his mission. He's done it now. Every day he'll have a coffee with somebody, and I'm amazed by his commitment to that. But he's met a lot of people, and I can't imagine that would be the most awful thing to me to try to copy all these people every day. But I'm amazed. But he likes that contact, that the personal contact, and I think you found ways to stay engaged, using obviously through all the different devices, technology to stay connected and to sort of move forward, even though you're in a way alone. So I found that always really interesting.
For sure.
Okay, so sorry about that. So what is your third and final tip?
This is kind of the obsession, I think, of all architects, is just thinking about natural light and thinking about that from the outset of a project. Designing for natural light, it's fundamental to good architecture. You guys are always thinking, step one for an architect, on a project is to do a site analysis. And, that step one in the site analysis is probably looking at the path of the sun on a site. And again, once you start thinking about natural light and how you're going to address that with your design, it sets all these other things in motion. It gets you thinking about, where to site the house properly, how you approach it, the context, everything in the context, how it relates to the topography. You start capturing, passive solar heating, obviously, natural illumination. You can even use it to set up natural airflows. We were talking about the dog trot. That building typology was evolved from, how the sun works in a really hot climate. If you create a pool of shade between two structures and it gets really hot outside, well, naturally the sun, that airflow is going to set up naturally through the house, through the dog trot. That cooler space is going to pull all the warmer air out from the inside of the facing pens of the dog trot. And so it's all these things that it sets in motion that, makes it really critical for me to consider from the outset. I'm sure you guys are, no different about considering that projects.
No, it's funny that you say that you guys are no different, but in fact, every architect, and Doug, we're all different. That's actually maybe not the first thing that pops up is natural light, although it's very important. But I find it really interesting that for you, it's thinking about the material palette, but also right away thinking about the light. The natural light is so critical to you. And maybe while it's important, maybe I'm completely thinking about something else, and maybe Doug is thinking about something else. So I think people are often surprised that architects, we don't really all follow the same playbook. I think that we prioritize different things, or I think that good architects are thinking about all of these things, but they're different priorities. And I might be completely thinking about how to make this porcelain tile look real. Whatever it is I'm thinking about, you're thinking about natural light. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we really do all look at things very differently. I look at everything in a kind of global way. and I'm a problem solver. So I'm not thinking as much about material palettes or light as I'm thinking about how am I going to solve this particular problem. All of those are clearly aspects of that, but that's not the first thing that I think about. And Stephen and I talk about this often. When we're discussing an architectural issue, he really talks about it much more. He talks about it like a professor. And I never really talk about things in those terms. And so I love listening to him, discuss all of these architectural issues, and hearing you talk about them is really kind of cool because we really are so very different.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And yet people would put the three of us probably in a similar box, yet we're so different, right?
Right, of course.
Yeah.
I like to, for example, Eric, I talk to Doug about experientially what it's like from the approach, arrival. Is there some sort of climactic space? Or I'm always sort of talking about it from that sort of how to choreograph movement through a building, and that will be first over other things. And he's like, that's interesting. I don't really. I'm thinking less about that and thinking about something else. And so I find it, I like talking to architects and think about, what it is that they're sort of focused on. And so it's interesting to hear what your thoughts.
But that experiential notion, that's very like Peter Zumthor. I don't know if you are into Peter Zumthor, but his whole idea about experiencing architecture. And for me, that's like intimately linked to light, not like
of course,
absence of light or the presence of light, and how you move through that. And and so I guess when I'm thinking about how to design a home, I think about I definitely think in those terms, like what is this like to walk up to this, and how are you drawn to this place or not drawn to it? And the sun is moving around the house throughout the day, and so how does that affect your movement inside? And so for me, it sets up all these, the problem solving aspects that you're talking about, Doug. Like that's how I solve problems, by thinking about it in those terms.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, Eric. So that's 3 topics. I really appreciate that. We don't want to take too much more of your time. I think people that are interested in what you're talking about would love to. They should really look at your YouTube channel, and I think I've read one of your books. I know you've got several. A lot of those are resources for architects, but I think people can find them very interesting as well. How can people learn more about you, find you on YouTube, see your architecture, hire you?
Yeah, the best place is just my website. So 30by40, it's all spelled out, 30by40.com. And the YouTube channel is 30by40.com/YouTube. So, but it's all linked up on my website. That's kind of the best place to find the most recent stuff. I put all my videos, recent video posts there, and that's a good spot to connect with me. And, I'm always answering comments on my YouTube channel. So it's a really positive, unlike maybe some places on YouTube, it's curated as a pretty positive place to be and interact and exchange ideas. And when we were talking about that earlier, just about how you connect with other pros, like that's a good spot for me to do it, because there's so many people watching the channel and engaging, and that's what I love. It's been a great social media outlet for me. It's been sort of energizing as a sole practitioner, because I can connect with people there in a way that I don't in my office, obviously. Nobody's coming to Maine this time of year, that's for sure.
Well, I would strongly recommend the first thing that people do is look at your film. I think it's a really great sort of it's about your life and how it's all one thing. In your practice and your life, it's all one thing. It's a beautifully made film. I thought you did a really nice job with that. I told you that when I saw it on LinkedIn, so I was really I thought that was a great project. But also, I think it's a really nice introduction to you, and whether it's like, hey, we want to hire you with it, or they want to buy one of your plan sets, or they just simply want to ask you a question. You've been I think really a great resource, and I think you've really done some fantastic work. So I really appreciate that you're so open with what you know, and I think a lot of architects they try to sort of keep it here, and I think that you've been really gracious in terms of trying to sort of share your knowledge, architecture, share information freely. Also, with your work at when you were a writer with House, I think you were doing similar things. You were writing for House, and which is a great platform for those who are interested in design. So I'm a big admirer, and I wish you continued success. So thank you again, Eric.
The YouTube channel, Doug, honestly was totally inspired by you, and so and that's not to diminish, your contributions, Stephen, either with Cool Spaces, but the like seeing you on YouTube and I heard an interview of you on the business of architecture, Doug, where you're talking about like, you know, all the different things that you're making. And like for me, just to be able to look to that as a practice model was super inspiring. And, you know, I love that you guys are doing a podcast. Like the podcast, and I'm not joking about this. I mean, this is the time arbitrage. You know, people can drive to work and listen to this. And, you know, that is the future. Like, I actually think video is probably becoming, you know, more diminished as time goes on, because people are realizing I can just sit in my car and get all this great information. And so, you know, you guys are sharing this information freely. And, you know, I love that about what you're doing. So any way that I can help you guys kind of further that mission, you know, I'm glad to do it.
Eric, how long is your commute? How long is your commute from your home to your office when you can listen to this podcast?
Are you asking me?
I'm talking to you. How long is your commute?
17 pace commute.
Exactly, 17 paces.
Yeah. Well, Eric, you know, what's interesting, thank you very much for saying what you did. I really appreciate that. You know, what's interesting about architects is most architects aren't good at everything. And, you know, it's where those faults lie. That's where their, you know, business ultimately fails or has challenges. So I think one of the neat things about you is, you know, the business of architecture is very, very challenging. Being a professional is probably one of the toughest things about architecture, at least for me. I love architecture, and but the profession can be really challenging, and, you know, doing business. But you clearly love that. You also like the details of architecture, and you're well suited for the business. So putting that together with the social media stuff and the YouTube thing you know, clearly you're having some real success with that. So I wish you all the best. You know, and the other thing that's interesting is you seem to have a lot of patience for all of this stuff. So when I compare what you're saying to how I look at a challenge, let's say it's the ties in a concrete wall, I'd throw up my hands and I'd be like, look, solve the problem. It's not my issue. And that really is where a lot of, that's where the success lies in making things with people, is you've got to have the patience to work through these challenges. And it sounds like you're doing a great job. So congratulations, and keep up the good work, and we'll stay in touch.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
Absolutely.
Okay. Take care.